Hey everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read so far this month. So as always, I do a mid-month check-in, and in my mid-month check-in I'm going to be talking about what I've finished so far within this month, what I'm currently reading, and then giving you some idea whether I'm going to be able to finish my TBR that I set out for myself at the beginning of the month. But so, without further ado, let's just dive into this video. This is the month of a couple of readathons that I'm participating in. So I'm participating in the Magical Readathon, in Becca's Bookoplathon, and I'm also participating in Series September. Now, for the most part, I'm not really going to be mentioning what prompts these books fit. You can just imagine that every single series that I continue in throughout this month is going to have some impact on Series September. And then I will definitely be mentioning Becca's Bookoplathon, but when it comes to Magical Readathon, I still kind of have to figure out which books I'm using for which particular prompts. But so, here we go. And this month, my reading order is determined by Becca's Bookoplathon. So whenever I finish a book, I roll the dice and the board decides what I pick up next. And the first book that I had to pick up this month was Swing Time by Zadie Smith, which is basically sort of like TBR veteran, though Swing Time is probably not the oldest Zadie Smith I have on my shelf. There is another Zadie Smith that I have on there. But so I have two Zadie Smiths on my shelf and I've never read Zadie Smith. So I'm very happy that Becca's Bookoplathon already made me change that I already got around to reading Zadie Smith for the first time. And when it comes to this book, it is an interesting one. I cannot recommend it. It is a book that I would never recommend to anybody. But at the same time, I really enjoyed my experience with this book, and I cannot really pinpoint why. I definitely enjoyed my reading with it. At no particular point was I bored. I really liked the writing style and thought that you could progress super fluidly through this story, in spite of the fact that this protagonist is a type of protagonist who has almost no agency. She almost makes no decisions for herself, for example. And that's the type of protagonist that I really cannot stand a lot of the time. And in spite of having a protagonist like that, I still managed to get through this book relatively quickly. And while reading it, I would also not be able to tell you guys what this story is actually about. Even at this point, it is almost impossible for me to really tell you what the story is about, because it is such a tightly woven, nuanced, deeply layered story where the plot is ultimately it's not really the goal of the story. There isn't a linear plot that you can point to saying this is what this story is about, and we will explore certain themes through that story. The biggest plot element, I guess, that I can talk to you guys about is that throughout this story we will be zooming in from time to time on a relationship between our protagonist, who goes unnamed for the entirety of the novel, and a close friend of hers called Tracy. Now, these two girls at an early age become very close to one another because they are the only two brown girls in their ballet class. And so they very much have a tight-knit relationship with one another, but it's also a relationship that has some sort of competition, some sort of conflict ingrained in it as well. So at times they seem thick as thieves, and at other times they are growing apart from one another. And throughout the vast majority of this page length, they are actually not really friends anymore. They don't see each other again, except for occasional chance encounters. However, in those few encounters, there is once again that very deep connection, and it's not necessarily a friendly connection at all times, because there definitely are events that take place and things that they do to one another that are more toxic, but there is that deep connection to one another and that deep sort of sense of understanding that they have for one another. There are a lot of themes going into the background. There is a lot of discussion of racism, but it's never really the foreground of the story. It's very much just a tapestry of many different encounters, many different places in which the story talks about racism, that really gives you more of an idea of the reality that Black people have to face all the time. And then another big thematic running through this is class differences or economic differences. The impact of money will definitely be something that is discussed on multiple layers throughout this book as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, but I cannot really recommend it because I don't think it is for everybody, and I really love the writing style and I really liked how it all came together towards the end, but it's also not a book that overwhelms, that impresses. It is more sort of book that silently unfurls. Next roll, I was lucky enough to land on the history prompt, meaning I could easily fit in Les Miserables. I did not read the full length of this book in the month of September, but I did still have some over 300 pages to go within this book when the month started. So Les Miserables is a 19th century French classic by Victor Hugo. It is of course the inspiration behind the musical Les Miserables. It has had many adaptations, both musical format and otherwise, and we can probably consider it to be the biggest French classic, at least the biggest internationally known French classic. I am very happy that I finally tackled this book. This was the longest remaining volume on my shelves, and I had actually not intended to tackle it in 2021, but I'm very happy that I have done so now, because now the biggest book that is left on those shelves is like 500 pages shorter than this one is, so that makes tackling my biggest book seem a lot more feasible next time around. But so Les Miserables is a story of Jean Valjean, who is an ex-convict who is still pursued by his past as a convict, because his yellow passport will always mark him as such and will always mean that people treat him in a certain way. As a result, he initially goes back to his sort of like thieving ways. However, an encounter with a local bishop changes his mind and changes his faith. Now, I'm not going to say too much about this story. There is a lot to it, as you can imagine, from its page count. The musical Les Miserables actually does a really good job at condensing this page length. However, you do of course have to sacrifice certain elements of this original story. For a big part, I think the sacrifices are things that I didn't really end up missing. This book is divided into 5 parts, and every single part starts with a big sort of like tangent that Victor Hugo goes on in relation to a certain theme. And for example, the start of this book is also like the slowest start that I think any book has ever had, because he first starts off with the whole history of this sort of bishop character that I just talked about. But so we don't actually dive into the full story proper until like 50 pages into the novel or anything like that. And so each of these parts will start with some sort of a big tangent. One of them is an entire rundown of the Battle of Waterloo. One of them is an entire explanation about the sewers in Paris. And so these sort of elements that are left out of the musical, I didn't really get anything out of reading them in this book. But what I do feel like I missed out on in the musical is some more depth and exploration of the character of Marius. For example, I think Marius is a very shallow, two-dimensional character in the musical, and we definitely spent a lot more page length in this novel establishing his character, establishing his moral dilemmas, and diving into his history, his family history. And I definitely thought that that was a huge improvement or a huge enrichment. And so that was the main thing that I was getting out of this book, atop of the original story. In terms of the actual plot, I will say that all sort of like plot-centric chapters really intrigued me a whole lot, and I really was flying through those. I really was engrossed with the story in the way that it was told by Victor Hugo. It was just that sometimes he will go on this sort of like tangent that really doesn't really serve the story at all, and that really doesn't serve the modern reader neither. In terms of its morals, it is sometimes a little bit too moralistic. Sometimes we spend so much time diving into the sort of like moral dilemma that a character will have, and exploring every single side of the argument and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and lingering on that conflict for a very long time, for too long of a time for me personally. But so yeah, really enjoyed this book, really happy that I finally got around to it, and I definitely think that the original is definitely also worth it. Next up, I had to finish a spooky read, and for that I finished Frenchmans Creek by Daphne du Maurier. This is a story about a mother who is basically quite adventurous and spontaneous in her personality, and she has made some choices in London that have made her decide that she wants to escape her everyday life. She wants to escape her everyday London life with her husband, and she goes to their country mansion together with her children to kind of escape and be free there. And when she arrives there, she hears stories of a local pirate crew, and ultimately her path will cross with the captain of this pirate ship. This is very much a story about a woman knowing what she wants and going after it, a woman escaping the humdrum of her everyday life, and through disguises, for example, and through the acceptance of an exceptional man, she gets to live out her wildest dreams. She gets to go on a real adventure. I very much enjoyed this book. It wasn't as dark as I thought it was going to be because I have previously read two other Daphne du Mauriers, Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel, and those two definitely have a lot more of a darker side to the atmosphere that is in the book than I felt there to be in Frenchmans Creek. There was a little bit of spooky vibes at the beginning, but I think that the pirate in and of itself felt too much like a gentleman to really deliver on sort of like spooky vibes for the remainder of the book once you were introduced to the captain himself. In terms of the storyline, I think I was constantly waiting for something darker to happen just because I expected that from Daphne du Maurier, and so that kind of let me down in the end, that I didn't really feel like it went to very dark places. However, I really enjoyed the writing style and I really enjoyed the way that this story works out, because you do have a mother leaving her children behind from time to time, for example, in order to live out her dream and to have her own life, to have her life which doesn't revolve around the happiness of her children, to have her be amongst men and do man things and, you know, not have anybody judge her for doing so. There are just a whole lot of elements to this story that I thought were very well done and that were definitely ahead of its time, and that you could definitely find back in a modern novel as well. In terms of the things that I didn't really like about this book, there were some instances of like not like other girls, but I definitely think that she was also mainly thinking about herself in that light. Whenever she was in conversation with men, she would always feel like men have that opinion about her, you know, have that opinion about women, and so that she has to defend herself in presence of men by indicating that she is not like those women that they think of. She is not that stereotypical image that they have of women in their minds. So I don't necessarily think that she really spends a lot of time considering herself to be not like other women, but that she just feels the need to defend herself against that stereotypical image of women that men have built up, especially around that time. So yeah, I enjoyed this one. Once again, not one that is going to like stick in my mind for a very long time, but it's definitely an enjoyable read and I'm happy that I got around to it. Next up, I also finished an arc. I did not do a dedicated review for this one because I don't think I have enough to say about it, so I will leave my comments about it in this particular wrap-up. But so I finished Meaty Pleasures by Lavin. This is a translated work from Spanish and it is a collection of short stories. Now, the description indicated that it's a collection of short stories in which sort of like desire meets the cruelty of life, and as a result I was expecting these to be sort of like dark, twisted tales, and that definitely was the case for some of these short stories, but for a very limited amount of the short stories. If you want to dive into the short story collection, I will definitely let you know that some of these stories are very explicit when it comes to the sexual encounter, so if you don't really like reading explicit sex scenes, then this is not really going to be for you. I think already the first short story, for example, is quite explicit. If you are now wanting to dive in specifically because of the explicit sex scenes, then do know that it's also not verging on erotica, for example. Some of the stories might, but the entire collection definitely doesn't. So a lot of these stories do talk about the human connection, but some of these I really felt to just fall flat. There's this one story all about the sort of like attraction that two characters have with one another and that they get to live out through dance, but I really felt like that story did almost nothing. For example, I didn't feel the attraction that they were feeling for one another, for example, and there was ultimately no sort of like point or ending or satisfying ending to that story. But so ultimately, as I said, there are a few short stories in this collection that I ultimately really liked, and those were usually the ones that had a sort of like dark twist, the way that I had anticipated being the case for all of these when I went into the story, but a lot of the times that wasn't really the case. But so yeah, that was ultimately a little bit of a disappointment. It is a short collection, it is only 180 pages, but for me personally I wouldn't really recommend it because I didn't really get anything out of this particular one, sadly. And so that is where we are at this point in time in terms of the books that I have finished so far, but I have definitely already continued when it comes to Becca's Bookworm. So I'm currently in the middle, almost finishing the next book within my TBR, and that is The Bands of Mourning. I will be finishing it either today or tomorrow. And then I have the rest of the month left to complete 2 other books on my TBR. I have already rolled again for Becca's Bookoplathon, so I know what the next book is that I'm going to be diving into. And I rolled big book, meaning that I can fit in Red Seas on the Red Skies by Scott Lynch. And so once I finish that, we'll have to see, because I only have 1 book left at that point, which is The Blade itself. I don't foresee any problem with being able to finish Red Seas Under Red Skies and The Blade itself still within this month. I am on holiday, but I think I can definitely finish Red Seas Under Red Sky in that holiday, and then it's just going to be a little bit of a tight fit to still finish The Blade itself. But if I push myself a little bit, I definitely think it is manageable. I'm hopefully already going to be able to start it a little bit on holiday. The one sort of thing that I'm still unsure about is, am I going to roll the final time in order to try and fit this into Bookoplathon? If so, what am I going to do if I cannot fit it in? Is that going to mean that I'm going to have to read something else instead of The Blade itself, thus upsetting the plan that I made myself for this TBR? Or am I just going to ignore the final roll that I do then in favor of this one? So that's going to be a dilemma for when I return from holiday, but we'll just have to see. In any case, the only one that's uncertain at this point is The Blade itself, but the other books on my TBR are already read or will be read by that point in time. So September is looking to be a good month. Sure, there were some books that I haven't really, that were all-time new favorites, but I've definitely been enjoying all of the books that I read so far, with the exception of that arc that just kind of left me indifferent, but that also was pretty short in its page count, so it also really didn't send me back or anything like that. So yeah, very happy with the way that the month of September has been going so far. And I've especially really been enjoying playing Becca's Bookoplathon as I go along throughout this month. And so maybe at later stages I need to redo this at some point, just have some sort of a TBR game guide me through my reading throughout the month, because I've really been enjoying that sort of game aspect to it and that sort of like chance aspect to figuring out what is going to be my next read. But so yeah, let me know if you'd be interested in me doing that, and if there are any particular TBR games you would like to see me tackle in that case. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video and see you guys for a future one. Bye!